Hey, everybody, and welcome back to another edition of the CGSP Roundtable. I'm Eric Olander, and as always, I'm joined by my best friends in the whole world right here. Talk about China this week. Jony Essa, who's joining us from Mauritius, and Cobus Van Staden from South Africa. Guys, how are you? It's been the end of a very busy week.
No, it's been good.
Yeah.
Morning.
It's morning, afternoon. We're recording this on
Yeah.
Friday, and I think this is a really important point that we have to make, because some of the events that we're going to talk about are changing so fast that by the time that this goes out, a lot is going to be dated, but that's the nature of the times that we're in. Let's talk about what we're going to talk about today. First, we're going to talk about the Chinese reaction to the Iran missile attacks in Israel. That's really very interesting. We're going to bring our good friend Jony Essa from Jerusalem, who runs our Arabic language service, to give us a perspective on why Israelis are especially frustrated right now, and also the dynamics of the Iran-Gaza Hamas-Israel conflict. Very, very complicated, fast-moving story, just changed again today. Then we're going to talk about Chinese Foreign Minister Wang. He's on a tour of Southeast Asia this week and also heading down to the South Pacific. We'll just touch in on that. And I was really excited to get some feedback from Cobus this week on some new statistics about Chinese climate issues, particularly in the fossil fuel side of things. Some coal statistics came up, and also oil data came in. And then we're going to touch base with Giraud on this Niger oil deal, $400 million deal between the Nigerian junta and CNPC, the China National Petroleum Corporation. So we've got a lot of cool things that we're going to talk about. So first, let's just get right into it, and we're going to let's bring Jony in on it. Johnny's our Middle East coordinator on everything to do with the Arab-Israeli issue. So let's first, Jony, hopefully you're safe today. Israel has just launched new counterstrikes against Iran since this week. Then last weekend, if you recall, the Iranians for the first time launched strikes on Israel. So what we're going to do, let me just bring up some screens here that we can first reference, and then I want to get your feedback on this. This is the Chinese Foreign Ministry's response. On Monday, the Chinese Foreign Minister Wang held calls with his counterparts in Saudi Arabia and Iran. In those remarks, and I don't know if you guys can read this, here's a little quick summary, and this is what pissed off the Israelis, and I want to get your take on this, Jony. China strongly condemns and opposes the attacks on Iran's embassy. This was Israeli attacks on a consular building in Damascus, or just outside of Damascus. And so the Chinese response then goes on to basically criticize what the Israelis did, but never and again brought up any kind of sympathy or understanding for what's happened to the Israelis. Jony, this got people a little bit annoyed in Israel. We then started to see some coverage that they were unhappy with the response that the Israeli, actually I'm getting confused here, that the Chinese gave to the Iranian missile strikes that took place last weekend. Jony, bring us up to speed on why Israelis were frustrated with this.
So throughout the conflict from October 7th until today, this is not the first time we've seen these kind of Israeli reactions to what China is saying. So China has kept a neutral stance, as neutral as it gets. It doesn't try to come out directly against the Israeli, tries to condemn, and tries to use a more, let's say, neutral, large audience task of connecting more to the large Arab world. So this isn't surprising to the Israelis. I don't know what the Israelis are expecting from the Chinese from exact condemnation, and they're going again and again and reiterating the fact that they expect the Chinese to act in another way when there aren't any facts on the ground predicting any other reaction.
And this was the same reaction that they had to the October 7th attacks as well, where they did not name Hamas by name. They did not call it a terrorist attack. They took sympathy with the Palestinian cause, but at the same time did not take much sympathy on the Israeli side. So this is something that's not new, is what you're saying.
It's not new at all. In my opinion, it's something that we're gonna like the Israelis. What's going on is the scene leading to the October 7 attack, the whole Middle East and Israel as well. They expected or did not expect in one way or another for the Chinese to be um, a more larger power on the Middle Eastern scene as a broker, mediator, or any other way. And now when things actually happen, they're expecting them for some reason to act as the United States and condemn anything against Israel. But this is not the strategic way the Chinese have done uh, from the past until the present and into the future. It just overwhelms me that they actually think that China is going to act in another way.
Yeah, it's kind of surprising. And you use this word neutrality, and this came up in a column or a post that was on the Institute for National Security Studies, the INSS, which is one of Israel's premier national security think tanks, written by Galia Levi, who is a researcher there in the China program. And she criticized, again, like a lot of Israelis, this so-called neutrality, because at the end of the day, they're not really being neutral. Just as in the Ukraine-Russia war, they've taken a side. They say they're neutral, but we all know from their rhetoric and their actions that neutrality requires you have some kind of equivalency, and they don't seem to have any equivalency here. But again, this came out this week. We showcased it. Tell us a little bit about what Galia was saying.
So Galia is basically saying that the Israelis just don't understand that China as a major power, as an upcoming superpower, it should stand. So the Israelis are talking the language of let's say good and bad of they're talking the language of being on the right side of history, on defending what's good. And this is something different than what other states or China is seeing or speaking. So they're speaking two different languages entirely. So for the Israelis, they believe that China as a superpower should condemn everything that's wrong with let's say the axis of evil, or let's say with the countries that defend this sort of violence, even though in this stream of events it's becoming more of like a circus of self-defense. The Israelis started, even though they claim that it's an act of self-defense, Iran needs to retaliate in one way or another. And now we're going on to the second round where Israel retaliates, and we need to see what China is going, how it's going to act moving forward. So we have reports in Israel that, and in the entire world, that Israel has stepped up an attack against Iran for retaliation. So we need to see in the upcoming days how China acts, and if it's going to act differently. I believe they're not going to act in any other different way than what they have done so far.
Yeah, Cobus, what's your take on that?
So yeah, I mean, one of the things I wanted to clarify was, in addition to complaints that China isn't reacting strongly enough or condemning the attacks, is there also a discourse that China is supposed to be using its influence with Iran to push Iran in a different direction? Because we've seen that discourse coming out in the US, and then some Iran-China scholars making the point that China actually doesn't have that much traction with Iran. So I was wondering how that discussion is happening within Israel.
So among Israeli scholars or the Israeli media, I think this issue is quite new. So it's not that strong as we've seen in the American issue, where we reiterate the American high officials again and again saying that China should intervene. So in Israel, I haven't heard in one way or another Israeli officials saying China need to intervene on behalf of restraining Iran. But I do hear in different variations that they believe that China should do more as a superpower, as a mediator, as a upcoming regional power. So like it continues the story of the Americans believing that China should retaliate. China should interfere more in restraining their friends in Iran if they believe that they have influence. But I actually believe that Israelis as well, they're speaking this game without actually believing that China has much influence over Iran.
Giraud, before we let Jony go, let's give you the last word.
So basically, we are in a situation where now China is trying to, Israel is really trying, has already framed the topic when Jony said the good and the bad. And when he said they want to China to behave like a superpower, like a regional power, it's much more like we want you to be on our side. But when we look at how China has been behaving, it's much more China doesn't want to antagonize itself with the Arabic country. It's been standing on the two-state principle. So also defending self-defense principle, because when he goes there by saying that, we did not, Israel had the right to attack, Israel had the right to retaliate against Iran. It's kind of counterintuitive to what China has been taking as posture since the beginning of this situation, even long time ago. So my question is, when you look at that, since October 7th, Israel trying to call on China to be much more quote unquote and superpower, how the feel I wonder if we still have that feeling that China is a friendly country in Israel, or it's more like they don't want to acknowledge it, but they say no, China is not the friendly country anymore, or it's like China is too big also to frustrate in Israel.
So again and again, we've seen articles written about this where they call is China a friend? Is China a foe? Is China an enemy? Is China? They keep asking the same question again and again. And after October 7, we've actually seen again and again the fact that the relations with China, they're not going to go away. They're not going to eradicate. They can't put them on hold. And for the Israelis in this environment going forward, where they're they are becoming more isolated and more unlegitimate internationally. So this is going to be a major thing that we need to look forward to. China, we can't say in any other way. China is a major power in world politics. And it's a major economic power, and it's a major economic partner of Israel, even more than the United States. So we're going to need to see this balance, and we've seen this again with with Irit Ben Abi, the Israeli ambassador to China, saying this, that we know our relations are a little wobbly, but we can't stay on the side and say that we're not going to interact with China because we don't like the way they've acted during the conflict. It's not going to work. And
economically, it's really critical. It's very critical. It's going to, and especially as you pointed out, Jony, that the fact that Israel is going to be increasingly isolated in many ways. For many countries, it's going to be a pariah state. We see that happening. And so China will be an economic partner, if nothing else, to sell cars, to sell products and whatnot. And that will be very important. Inflation is probably going to go up in Israel as goods become more expensive, and China will be critical to keeping that economy somewhat stabilized.
Not just this, assuming that the war is going to end one day, there's going to start a post-war reconstruction, and I think China will actually be very active in that post-war reconstruction, assuming that Middle Eastern countries are going to also be involved. So if the UAE and Saudi Arabia and Egypt are going to be involved in some sort of post-war reconstruction, I think they won't they won't agree to come with the table without bringing China into that table one way or another. Even
Okay.
China as a power will not stay aside and will allow itself to get involved in one way or another. So we need to see what kind of involvement that will be.
Okay, Jony, thank you so much for your insights. Really appreciate it. Jony is our Middle East editor based in Jerusalem, and he runs our Arabic language service. Stay safe, Jony. We really, we genuinely mean that in these days and these times.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, guys, this issue on it's so fast moving, it's so complex. China is a major player. Let me bring you over to my neighborhood here in Southeast Asia, and I want to run some video that's related to what's going on in the Arab Israeli conflict, and now the Iran-Israeli conflict as this thing kind of expands. Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi was in Indonesia. Indonesia is one of a growing number of countries that has been very vocal in their support of the Palestinian cause and their denunciation of both the United States and the Israelis. So I want to get your reaction to some sound from both the Indonesian and the Chinese Foreign Minister that happened this week. So let me. And so this was so interesting just to watch. Just take a listen to this.
最近，安理会终于第一次通过了要求加沙立即停火的2728号决议。
It's all about.
美国这次没有敢继续站在国际道义的对立面，选择了弃权。但是呢，美方却声称这一决议没有约束力。美方的这一言论令世人大跌眼镜，再次暴露了美国的霸权心态。国际法在美国眼里似乎只是想用就用，不想用则弃之的工具。
So now we're going to hear some remarks from Indonesia's foreign minister.
Kita semua memiliki kekhawatiran.
Again, all focused. A little hard to read, but it's all focused on the Middle East.
Kita memiliki pandangan yang sama mengenai pentingnya semua pihak menahan diri dan pentingnya untuk melakukan deeskalasi. Saya menjelaskan mengenai upaya diplomatik yang dilakukan Indonesia sejauh ini. Dan saya yakin RRT akan menggunakan pengaruhnya guna mencegah terjadi.
Kobus, this is very interesting because it highlights how the conflict is resonating far beyond the Middle East. In South Africa, obviously, this was a major issue. Here in Southeast Asia, that was the focus yesterday of Wang Yi's visit with the Indonesian foreign minister. It feels in many respects that they're taking advantage of the United States' position on what's decidedly a very unpopular position in the global South. When you see Wang Yi and the Indonesian foreign minister focusing on the Middle East in a visit in Southeast Asia, what do you think about?
Well, it does make sense that considering that Indonesia is the world's most populous Muslim state, so that would be a natural space to discuss some of these issues. I think what it also makes clear is that obviously for the US, the larger project of US security and US influence, Israel is pivotal in the Middle East. For China, that's not necessarily true. China has a different set of relations, and it's pursuing a different set of relations, particularly with the Arab world. So in that respect, its relationship, while China has a lot of investment and trade with Israel, that relationship doesn't really compare to the other bigger fish that China has to fry in the Muslim world. So this is one of those kind of forums where you can see, oh, okay, this is how this issue kind of plays out in different ways, on the US side and the Chinese side.
One of the other main messages that came out of Wang Yi's visit to Jakarta, where he met with outgoing President Jokowi, and he also met with, and I'll show you later, Subianto Prabowo, the new incoming president, who's now currently the defense minister. But the key message was stay vigilant against small cliques. This is intended to keep Indonesia on the sidelines, or to at least remain loyal to its non-aligned strategy and pledge going back all the way to the Bandung Summit in 1955. And the Chinese are very, very concerned about more Southeast Asian countries coming into the South China Sea conflict with the United States and the Philippines, now Japan, Australia. So these small cliques. And Giraud, you know, when I see this, the Chinese are very sensitive to the idea of bloc diplomacy. But at the same time, it also feels that the Chinese are building their own blocs. So we have the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, we have the BRICS, we have the Belt and Road Initiative. There's any number of these different groups that are forming on the Chinese side. Now, the Chinese will tell you that those groups are open to everyone. Whether or not they are is a different story, but they will also then say, well, the AUKUS and the security arrangements that are here in Southeast Asia are not open to everyone, and that's the big difference. But this bloc diplomacy now is becoming a major theme of Chinese diplomacy in Asia, but also around the world. What's your reaction when you see this kind of stuff?
Yes, that bloc diplomacy is very much true. And we've seen that playing out in Africa, the way China has been playing its diplomacy in Africa, creating that bloc ally with almost all 53 African countries, the way they react when China is quote unquote under aggression when it comes to Taiwan or any kind of issue related to the one China policy. That's very much true what China has been doing, even in South China Sea, in Southeast Asia, creating its own bloc. And you mentioned that with different organizations that China has been putting in place or even pushing forward, it's clearly that China has understood that in this world, in the global order, it needs now to have it needs to start counting its friend, to ally, people, country that it can count on when it comes to counter the narrative or counter the posture, the diplomatic posture coming from the West. And when they say that yes, their bloc remains open to every country, I think they really mean that they really believe the bloc is open. The reality is the narrative around the blocs they're creating are just so in opposition with the rest of the narrative than any other country in any Western country would want to carry on. So those Western countries won't feel comfortable joining any kind of bloc that China will be creating, or that will be turning around China's position or China postures. And we see now how those blocs are even reacting in those conflict in the Middle East, with the way Russia, the way China reacted Iran when in the retaliation to what happened in the consulate in Lebanon. And we also see that in South China Sea, that China is really trying to mix different layers of its diplomacy on different issues to create a very strong bloc around what it believes to be the keys to stability for its own interest in the close to its neighborhood in the middle, in the Southeast Asia. I'm gonna get to that, and also in the Middle East, where it's really expanding its own influence, making sure that it still has Arabic countries on its side. So yes, that bloc diplomacy, it's very much alive. It's much more relevant now that we are talking about the new Cold War, the new world order. You cannot be shy into counting your friends. You have to be counting your friends and make sure that you are really, when time comes, you're going to be counting on them. So yeah, it's really the head where we are going now.
One of the new friends that the Chinese are really trying to make and to get close with is Prabowo Subianto, who is the incoming president, the current defense minister. The Chinese have done a full embrace of this guy since he won the election. And even before he was named president, Chinese ambassador to Jakarta, Lu Kang, went over to his house and his private residence and met with his cat, and they posted pictures. The Chinese, in fact, even congratulated Prabowo before he was even named president, long before the other powers did. And then Prabowo Subianto, as president-elect, was just in Beijing meeting with President Xi Jinping. That is very, very unusual to have a president-elect to meet with President Xi Jinping. Normally, they like to wait until they take office. But this goes to show you, Cobus, that these big global South countries like Indonesia are very much in play. In our podcast this week on our Africa channel, we talked a lot about the great power competition that's happening in Africa over critical minerals. Indonesia is another one of these countries where it is playing out in real time.
Yes, I mean it's very in all of this block creation on all of these different sides. There's always an interesting distinction between countries that are included because they are kind of trans-regional players. You know, the way that Australia is or Japan is in the case of the US alliance. And then countries that are included because they are the theater where these tensions are sitting. You know, where like arguably the Philippines, you know, fulfill that role, I think. So you know, so it's then on the Chinese side, it then becomes interesting to ask, you know, what role a country like Indonesia is playing. And of course, you know, Indonesia has been historically over the last few years and before has been very independent and has been really kind of avoiding any, you know, the optics of being pulled into any of the camps. They're quite kind of anxious around kind of maintaining their own independence and freedom of movement. So this shift at the moment is going to be very interesting, I think, and you know, to see kind of like how Indonesia positions itself in a space where I think there's a really kind of like, I think it's not acknowledged how symbolically powerful that kind of pecking order is, you know. So I think when China kind of complains about this clique diplomacy, then I think they may well be that those complaints may well be resonating with smaller countries who feel kind of sidelined or who feel instrumentalized in some kind of way compared to a country like Australia, who's seen as, you know, this kind of like peer partner, you know, to these powers. So those kind of power differentials are going to be an issue, I think.
Jérôme, when I think of Prabowo, it reminds me of a lot of African leaders and military chiefs, because Prabowo has deep ties into the U.S. military. One of the things that we know out of the coups in the Sahel was a lot of the military leaders were trained in the United States as well. And it's just very interesting. And I think that the Chinese are somewhat anxious about the fact that the U.S. military ties in the Indonesian military and also in the Philippine military run very, very deep. And so we don't see that, but that might be what the Chinese are also trying to address.
Of course, they're also trying to address that, especially in the case when you compare to Africa, there's a lot of difference in a way that in Africa, that's what I also believe, that because there is no really very strong security component in that in the U.S. engagement in Africa. That's why the military train in the U.S., the African military train in the U.S., have much more, I'd say, leeway or leverage to leverage their own internal security situation. That's why they can also make coups and still do business with China. It's the case in Guinea with Doumbouya, was trained in the US, but really moved forward with the Simandou, that's the Simandou project. Same with Niger, with Chani and everything. They all have training they've all had trainings in the US, but still, since the US doesn't have a very strong security element in the region, they can still move their own internal national leverage to move their own agenda. But it's different in Southeast Asia because you have a strong security component there. And this is where China says there is a kind of existential threat to it, because having military training in the US is something, but having them in countries where you do have security issues in your doorstep, it becomes much more worrying. You really have to make sure that those military are really where they do stand and how they work with you. And this is very interesting when you see how China moved with Prabowo. I noticed it's a bit of its odd, taking into account their own diplomatic stand of non-interference, of being much more prudent, being much more safe. But here they really went their way into really embracing and taking him close. And this is where you see that when they say non-interference diplomacy, it really depends on where, on when, and then the situation where they really play it smart. We don't really interfere, but we are really showing that we would like you to be there and we would like you to be our friend. It says you that I believe that even that China's posture in non-interference later on in its diplomacy, we're going to see a lot of nuance happening and emerging depending on how close its national interest might be in danger.
Well, don't forget that Indonesia, as Cobus mentioned, is not only the largest Muslim majority population in the world, it's also the largest country in Southeast Asia. 300 plus million people. It's a huge market for Chinese products. It's a major source of nickel in the EV battery metal race. There is so much about Indonesia that is important. And so it's not surprising to me that they are zeroing in, particularly as sanctions on Chinese EVs, potentially in Europe, but certainly in the United States. As the Chinese market gets smaller around the world, they're going to need these big markets like Indonesia in order to offset some of the losses that they're having in the G7 countries. So,
and talking about that, it's because of Chinese investment in Indonesia, and that's the US, when they were defining foreign entity of concern in the IRA, they made sure that they say, let's keep private companies, because they understand that because of Indonesia, if we put all Chinese linked entity, we might missing out on something. So yeah, they say, because of that as well. So Indonesia is really key in that strategy that China is playing in different spaces: security, regional, EV batteries, whatever you name it.
Yeah, and one of the things that we're going to start doing a little bit more, you and I, Jérôme, is looking at the Indonesia, Congo, Zimbabwe, these links in the battery supply chain, and what lessons can be learned. I think it's really interesting that, again, Indonesia is at the center now of the great power competition in many respects. And so there's some lessons, I think, for African countries and even Latin American countries as well on how to manage that from Indonesia. Let's quickly move on now. And I've been looking forward to getting Cobus's take on this one. This is a graphic that we saw over on Carbon Brief that shows Chinese coal production. So here's the headline: China responsible for 95% of new coal power construction in 2023. Cobus, you've been following these climate change issues and Chinese coal, fossil fuel, oil. Does this surprise you in many respects? Again, this is Chinese domestic, okay? Because the Chinese back in 2022, was it, Jérôme, when Xi Jinping was at the UN General Assembly, announced that they're going to stop financing overseas coal plants, but domestically, it's skyrocketing up. Cobus, this is a little bit odd because we have a couple different narratives here. On the one hand, China is seen as a leader in green energy and also a leader in green and renewable energy. And at the same time, we also have another data point that I'd like to get your take on, is that they imported last year a record amount of oil. So massive coal power plant construction, record amounts of oil. What do you take away from this at the same time as also being a leader in renewable and sustainable energy?
I mean, in the first place, just seeing the numbers and seeing the graphs just make me want to like run screaming into the street, you know. But the
because the scale that China's
so
doing this
awful.
on is enormous.
Yeah,
this is not
the
the scale is massive.
And kind of that is the paradox that defines China in our world. Is that it's simultaneously, it has this kind of contradiction between, on the one hand, having put massive amounts of money into developing renewables. So China's by far, by orders of magnitude, the biggest kind of producer of many renewable technologies. And to the extent that anyone who puts in solar is essentially working with China, whether they plan to or not. And so, so on the one hand, then China is also simultaneously like maniacal about national security and energy security, which leads to huge amounts of oil imports, which essentially changes the geopolitical landscape of the entire world. And then at the same time, China's also, locked in a cycle of having to provide stimulus, to rural economies within China, which are, many of them have very large coal reserves, very large labor pools within those coal industries, and they're politically very, very difficult to stop that kind of funding and that building. So all of this makes for just a conundrum, like a complete kind of contradiction that is going to define China's historical position in relation to this crisis. Kind of like that's going to be these contradictions are going to be positioning like how we think of China in the future, I think.
But it's the same dynamic with the United States as well, because the United States has done remarkable things now in green energy. They've actually cut their emissions. I think it's by 20, 30, 40%, real major progress in cutting emissions. At the same time, the United States is the largest oil producer in the world, even more than Saudi Arabia. And so we have some parallels here between these two superpowers who go to countries like yours and to the Congo and start preaching sanctimoniously about green sustainable energy. And at the same time, they're buying up more, producing more coal, and generating more fossil fuel. I mean, the hypocrisy from both of them is just, it makes you want to vomit. I mean, I can't get past it. And we talked about Australia, Canada, Norway. Jérôme, this has been something we've talked about as well. These countries will talk green, 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 green. And yet I haven't seen one Norwegian talk about how let's stop selling oil and let's take Statoil and kind of shut it down, right?
You want them to go bankrupt or what? You want the country to go bankrupt?
Well, principles are subject to circumstance is the old saying, right?
Exactly.
I mean, so.
Exactly. That's the hypocrisy, all of it. It's the hypocrisy of all of it. And you have the feeling when you look at how China is behaving, it's as if China is buying its rights to pollute more. It's like, I'm going to put as much as money I can and lots of money in everything that is green. So at the end, when you hear the numbers about the coal, about the pollutant, about everything else, about the fossil fuel, no one's going to come and say, you are polluting. Say, no. There's no one better than me who's doing better in terms of green energy and everything. It's really buying its own right on kind of keeping on doing what it does. Like, we acknowledge the need for to have green energy, for the world to move from fossil fuel, but you're also not going to undermine our own capacity to develop and keep on moving forward. So we're going to provide you the solution in one hand. Here the solar, here the everything that's green that you can use, the funding and everything. But in the same time, for us, we're gonna keep on using fossil fuel because this is major. It's really key. I really believe that at some point they're gonna merge. They're gonna switch to much more green driven development. But for now on, we're gonna go straight full on coal and fuel and fossil fuel because that's the reality of development and industry right now.
So what we're seeing here, Jérôme, and this is a perfect segue because some of that fossil fuel is going to start coming from Niger. So earlier, I think it was last week, actually. It wasn't this week, but
it was exactly last week, Friday, the 12th.
Yeah, last week, Friday. And so what you're seeing there is the Chinese embassy and representatives from the China National Petroleum Corporation. CNPC, by the way, is, I think, the 4th or 5th largest company in the world. They signed a $400 million deal for oil. Now, don't forget that the Chinese also built a brand new oil pipeline connecting Niger to the Atlantic coastal port in Benin as well. So that's all good to go. We've learned some new details this week about this deal. What's your take on it, Jill? Tell us more about it.
So basically, this deal is about Niger signing a commercialization contract, trading contract with CNPC on how they're going to sell the fossil fuel. Because CNPC is the one owning what we call the petroleum field of Agadem in the north of Niger, where they're going. That's where the pipeline is coming from. So both Niger and CNPC are going to sell the oil that's coming from that. So this ceremony was signing the contract and who's going to sell what and how much is going to be sold in it. And during that ceremony, because of that contract, CNPC is going to give like 400 million in advance of the oil they're going to sell from the oil field. It's not a gift. It's a kind of a loan because Niger is going to pay it back plus 7% interest within 12 months. It's kind of giving them, we're giving you money now just in case you're going to pay us back.
I want to stop you right there on this money thing because just last month, the head of the African Development Bank, he had this wonderful kind of comment that came out, and I want to play it for you in the context of this Niger.
The risk that one has with natural resource-backed loans, as far as I'm concerned, is that they're just bad, and bad. First and foremost, because you can't price the asset properly. If you have minerals, oil, metals, and gas under the ground, it's not actually being marketed. So how you actually come up with the price of that for a long-term contract, it's a challenge. The second is that the negotiation is very asymmetric. Most countries that want to do natural resource-backed loans are probably dealing with bigger countries, bigger commercial banks that want to give them a loan and say, well, look, it's urgent, we need it, but this is what you have to sign. But it is those that actually want to give the loan that have the upper power, not the person who wants, or the country that wants to receive the loan. I think Africa should put an end to natural resource-backed loans. And I'm particularly worried, I must say, for Africa in the sense that the volume of concessional financing, low-cost concessional financing, has been going down over time. And so you have a situation where so much of this loan are now short-term loans, and it's a mismatch.
Okay. So this is effectively exactly what he was saying he shouldn't do. This is this is exactly it. $400 million for resources. It's not priced against the value of the resource. It's an emergency loan. Is this not perpetuating what is already been not a productive deal for Angola and for Ghana and for any others? Is the Niger in that context, this Niger deal? Should we see it in that context?
It's a bit different. It's a bit different
Okay.
in the case. It's a bit different because this here we have actually the price of fuel. We have the price of oil. It's not like, it's basically, let me just give it simple. CNPC and Niger will be selling their own share of oil from the Agadem field. So what CNPC, the junta, has done is like, okay, guys, from what we are going to sell in advance, can you give us a bit of money? So when we're gonna sell our own share, we're gonna pay you back. So we only know the price of we only know the price of the barrel of petrol, how much is going to cost. We know the benefits they're going to make and everything. Of course, those prices are going to change over the time, over the years, over a few months and everything. But we do know it's not like they backed the loan onto a new project that's going to be, they're going to invest in. No, the oil is already there, just by basically selling what's already there. So it's a bit of different than what Adesina is mentioning in this situation. And this is also something different. What people those who have not been following, it's like the fact that this deal was like the Niger basically strong-armed CNPC to give them that 400 million. Why? For the simple reason that for the last few months, the junta has been pushing and has been even also taking away certain field oil from CNPC, and CNPC was not really happy about that. So they kind of strong-armed CNPC into giving them those 400 million to remain and to keeping in friends. And CNPC also for him, like, they have much more interest into those loans to be happening because it allows the pipeline to be open. The pipeline that was constructed and that was inaugurated in December 2023, that's now online. It's allowed them to kind of now making the pipeline running because they need to recoup the 400. They need to recoup the 4 billion investment they put in that pipeline. It's a very difficult. It was a quote unquote, I'd say difficult, but mix of situation where each part made a concession to get things moving forward in the direction.
Well, let me also put this into a different context. And Cobus, I'd like to get your take on this. This is a quote from Peter Pham. There we go, Giraud. This is a guy who we've been following for a long time. Yeah. I've never understood why he's as influential in Washington as he is, but he is a regular commentator. Just Google Peter Pham and you'll see the whole backstory. That's all I know. But he pointed out on X that the deal comes at an interesting time when the Americans have flamed out in Niger. The Russians are coming in. The French obviously have struggled in all of the Sahel. The struggle is to put it mildly. They've been booted out. So this comes at an interesting point in time, again, for the changing dynamics of great power competition in the Sahel. What's your take on this, Cobus, when you see these deals and see comments like that from Peter Pham?
Well, I was wondering about a similar dynamic, but at the same time, I'm a little hesitant about making that, and I wanted to ask Giraud about that. I was a little slightly hesitant about making completely conflating the kind of commercial corporate side of this deal making with the geopolitical side of it. So, exactly. So Giraud, I actually wanted to ask you, to which extent do you think this can be directly connected to the retreat of the US and France from Niger, or to which extent are there other kind of issues involved?
It's really not connected that much, because reality, even if the US has still had this base in Niger, this deal would still happen, because in the context where the coup d'etat happened, the junta is a bit isolated financially from France, from regional bloc powers and everything, and CNPC and the Chinese investments are the only one that has the enough financial cash to give them to keep the administration running and everything. So the US, even the base was still open. If they still had the cooperation, they still moved forward with CNPC, because that pipeline is a very much important source of financing for both Niger and Benin as well, because Benin is going to receive 25% of transit oil coming from that pipeline. So it's a lot of money for all the country and all the parties involved. So it's not really related to the geopolitics of it, like US or not, that pipeline would have moved forward. US, France or not, Niger still would have kind of pushed CNPC to make that pipeline moving faster than it was before. Yeah.
Cobus, what I was taking away from this, again, I think what Giro is saying is right about separating the geopolitics from the corporate, but I think it speaks to the dexterity that Chinese companies have in these very fluid situations. We've seen that in the DRC for 20 years now, that the DRC is one of the most difficult countries in the world to do business in, bar none. And yet they have not only survived, but they've thrived. Giraud often talks about Guinea and the Samandu mine. And so when we talk about the transitions that the Sahel countries have gone through, and the fact that Chinese companies are adapting very, very quickly in some of these very difficult parts of the world. That's my big takeaway from this, is that it doesn't seem to derail them when you have these major coups. And I think my guess is what happens, and Giraud, this is purely speculative, is that the day after the Niger coup, the Chinese ambassador goes into the junta leaders and says, "Are we good? Is there any problem here? You got any issue with me?" And they're like, "Are you going to take a side of the French or the Americans?" Nope, that's not us. "Are you going to keep the oil pipeline construction going?" "Yep." "Then we're good. Keep your head down and keep going."
We're on schedule. Yes, we're on schedule.
We're on schedule. And basically just STFU, shut the F up and stay out of our business and you'll be fine. And that works really well with the Chinese. Whereas the Americans, I mean, Molly Fee, who's the Assistant Secretary of State, from my understanding of the reading of it, they were not happy with the political transitions. They're not happy with, and she went in, and the junta leaders apparently felt that it was very condescending and said, "Get the F out."
No, even the US, the US got played in this situation, because when the coup happened, France was much more strong in that position.
Exactly.
We have to resume. We have to go back to Mamadou Bazoum, who puts him back in power. The US was much more real politics. No,
that's right. They kept a low profile up until this point.
It's okay, because they wanted to make sure that we not frustrate the new leaders, because we have an American base there. Once they realized that, the new junta is like, "Guys, I really don't care. I'm really not happy with the way you do things." They also got frustrated. It was already too late. And friends looking at them and say, "Guys, we've told you before that you should have, taken our side when this situation was happening." But in all of that, China say, "Guys, I have no problem with you guys. Security wise, nothing. Me, it's that pipeline. 4 billion is a lot of money." And China was kind of, same with Guinea when the coup happened. In this case, also, China was kind of worried a bit. They even tried to mediate the between Mamadou Bazoum, the former president, and the junta leader, President Chiani, to try to find a common ground. But they soon realized that it was not really the space to be. And they remained in the space to make sure that our pipeline is up and running, our field oil investment is still up and running, and they stayed out of the way. They let the geopolitics play between the US, the ECOWAS, and the French and everything, but then they kept the business running. And they even, according to certain reports, they even put pressure on Patrice Talon, president of Benin, of when he visited China in September, telling him, "You have to let that pipeline go," because Benin, member of the ECOWAS, was put under pressure to isolate Niger. And China, what the report is saying, China kind of made him understand that it's in your best interest to really let that pipeline go. So once Benin said, I have no problem. The pipeline can be open. The oil can run. Things were kind of the game was open for both Niger and Benin.
So this question of resources, oil, also came up this week in our podcast, which if you listen to our audio podcast right here on YouTube, you can do it. We talked about critical minerals in Africa. So this great power competition that we've seen playing out in the Sahel is also playing out in the Congo. Cobus, this came out of the USIP, this report. It's a fascinating report. It's done by what they call a senior study group, which has some really big names in it. What were the key findings for those who haven't heard our podcast yet from this report? And again, this was a kind of a wake-up call for the U.S. to get in the game in Africa for strategic resources, which the Americans are very far behind the Chinese. Give people just the headline from this report.
Well, the report, as you say, was making the call that there should be a more, there's already a lot of work going into US kind of catching up with China on critical minerals in Africa, and this was kind of adding more kind of impetus to that process, and in the process, kind of suggesting ways in which they can engage, making the point that they need to strategically maybe tolerate some companies or some entities slight cooperation with Chinese entities.
That's
in order
the
to
tactically
kind of
address is what they
tactically
say.
address it. Yeah,
that's the word.
In order to kind of to move this forward, they can't be too hardline on completely kind of expelling all Chinese influence from the mix, because I think that's practically very difficult.
I know, but it's funny that as they say this, though, that Mike Johnson, who's the Speaker of the House of Representatives, the number 3 in power in the United States, called out, I think on Thursday, said that China's part of a new axis of evil. And so one has to wonder when think tanks like this publish these moderate, very nuanced, very textured arguments, and then it runs into the buzzsaw of domestic politics in the United States where nuance goes to die. It wonders how viable it is, this idea of tactically addressing the Chinese and not always coming down when they've just said you're part of a new axis of evil. Where do you go from that when you say you're a new axis of evil?
But even adding to what Kobe said, and they even in the report they even mentioned the IRA as being undercutting U.S. ability to invest in countries in Africa. Mind you, IRA is a bipartisan kind of policy between the Republican, all of them, but they still kind of went to the IRA should also be that. You should be really careful about that as well. They were really nuanced, and I think that many people might be not happy about that.
I wonder if that. I mean, again, we need think tanks. This is what think tanks do: is to get us to think about these issues. So I think it's really important to do it. But Cobus, do you get the sense when you see these types of reports that there's an appetite for that type of rhetoric and these ideas in Washington to actually get in the game for to compete with the Chinese on these issues on critical minerals?
Well, I think there's certainly a strong kind of policymaker push on that, on both in the US and in Europe. What I think is a lot harder is the actual nitty-gritty of how that's going to work. Particularly because they are very dependent on the Western private sector, who has their own set of agendas and priorities. That includes some companies being very risk averse about working in Africa, and other companies having been in Africa for a long time, but not necessarily always very happily, or the Africans are not necessarily very happy about the outcomes of that engagement. So so those are both issues. I think similar to Niger, I think what one of the things that this really shows is that China benefits a lot from its relatively limited engagement. So China isn't there wanting to necessarily set norms or kind of protect democracy or have any kind of input into how the countries are run. They're there to do this particular business, and so they are quite flexible and quite nimble in relation to that. But also they are operating as they're not legacy powers in that region, right? They're newcomers, so they don't have that much baggage that they bring with them. And so I was thinking, kind of the West is constrained on so many different ways in dealing with this because there's so much previous history, Western history in that area. So for example, as you were saying, that the US was taking this low kind of profile kind of approach to Niger, but and in a lot of ways that ended up not really helping them. But if one thinks about a kind of a counterfactual situation where the US rushed in to support French power in Niger, that would have looked terrible
Exactly,
in Africa, right?
yeah,
Like
really
that would have
bad.
gotten them condemned left and right. So there's a little bit of they're constrained on lots of different sides in the way that the Chinese aren't, because they knew, but also because they're a lot smaller. They're not there with the full apparatus of the state and the military and a military base and blah blah blah. You know, kind of they're only there for the minerals and the oil, and that's an easy basis to do business on. You know, kind of with a junta.
Well, we had a chance to speak, as you can see here, with Ambassador Terence McCauley, and it was a fantastic discussion. So I hope everybody will have a chance to listen to that interview we did. Cobus, you brought up an issue about how the Chinese are, in many ways, working off of a system that was designed by Western colonialists. This extractive relationship in Africa was not one that was pioneered by the Chinese or anybody else. It was pioneered by the British, the French, the Portuguese, and others. And so, and again, this is what makes it somewhat awkward from the Western point of view, where they come in with this very sanctimonious tone that says, we are going to help labor, we're going to be better than the Chinese, we're going to help the environment, we're going to be more inclusive. Jérôme, what you found in your cobalt data research, though, was that, and this is also to a point that Cobus has made many times over the years, is that Western companies are oftentimes, in the eyes of the think tank community in Washington, seen as an extension of the government. So they'll say, we want Glencore, as if Glencore somehow is going to be favorable, or Ivanhoe or Anglo-American or any of these Western mining companies or logistics companies. But what your data in the Congo cobalt sector shows is that those companies are mercenaries at the end of the day. They will do business with anybody and everybody, including the Chinese. And so counting on them to somehow be a bulwark against the Chinese doesn't seem like it's going to be an effective strategy.
It's not. It's they are profit-driven entities. They are private profit-driven entities, and they follow where the money goes. And that was when you talk about that. It reminds me in all those debates. Few weeks back, we had the executive of First Quantum, the Canadian company, who rushed to Beijing to talk with Tsingshan and Chinese government in a way that to find a way where Chinese government and Tsingshan was the largest producer, copper producers in the world, to say, can you buy some stake in First Quantum product that we have in Zambia and elsewhere in the world? That just tells you how much the private sector looks at all this narrative coming out from Washington and London and Brussels about all those. They look at them and say, guys, you know, at the end of the day, if you cannot put me $5 billion on the table when I need someone to buy back my bad assets somewhere in Chile, you are not really useful to me. You are really not useful to me. You are not really helping me in this situation. So, yeah.
And the other problem I had with the report, the USIP report, is it didn't acknowledge the low prices of these battery metals. And this is not a temporary downturn. We've been in this slump now where we're 80% off the highs for the past 2 years. And that keeps the profit-driven companies on the sidelines from getting invested. So when they talk about mobilizing private capital to invest in mining in the Congo and Indonesia and Bolivia and elsewhere, that private capital doesn't want to go if they have prices that are, again, so 20% what they were. And the report doesn't acknowledge that. And I think that's a big problem.
That ability of China to play this long game where they know that these are going to be, the prices are going to spike in the future, but they're keeping, but they're using oversupply at the moment to keep them low and to essentially keep competitors out of the market. It's very interesting to see in action, and it's a very significant challenge, I think, to Western actors, because you can't make the Western shareholders kind of like jump into that field if they're not going to be making money. It's very difficult to do.
This is where I'm perplexed, because when you bring this issue up to people in Washington, they will say, well, the Chinese have advantages because of their system that we don't have. We're not set up that way. And yet the Biden administration managed to find $50 billion to support the American chips industry, the semiconductor industry. The Americans found $50 billion to bail out the auto industry during the financial crisis. The Americans have an ability to find money to do industrial policy when it suits them. And so I'm surprised that they are not investing the money to do the risk insurance to backstop these private companies to go into the Congo, much the same way that Sinosure does that with CMOC and does it with Zijin Mining and others, in order to give them that room that in case the investment goes south, well, they're covered by risk insurance.
Because that's also reputation.
But reputation, but you would think that the Americans, they're capable of doing this. They're just choosing not to in many respects.
I think they just beyond that, they're also counting them.
And the Europeans are doing the same thing, by the way. It's not just the Americans. I should.
Yes, that's true. That's true. But they also, I think they're also counting the ability that they have really on hands to really act directly. Because let's face it, if they have to do that for every mining companies they do have, they say we want to go to Africa, they're gonna have to put billions of dollars just to do that, and which is something they cannot really do. China has the advantage of have strong state-owned companies, very big, strong strength. You have an amount of number of players that you can count on. But the US, you have a whole bunch of private companies. So if you have to back them all up, you're gonna be putting money.
People are gonna back them up.
I have a project somewhere in Zambia. I need you to back me up with 1 billion. I have a project somewhere in DRC. They're gonna be just following up and down. You're gonna be like, guys, we are a market-driven economy. We are not, a social kind of.
That's what they say. That's exactly what they say.
I would be very interested to hear some kind of insider account of whether any of this kind of support, like government support for new energy metals, is being blocked in any way by the hydrocarbon industry lobbies in the US and Europe. I have no idea. But I was wondering whether that is kind of being quietly kind of undermined in the back, in the background by oil and gas companies. Because of course we know that both the US and particularly the US, kind of has a lot of there's a lot of kind of like a non-stated but official backing for for the continuance of kind of oil and gas exploration. I see numbers that kind of where Western countries still are really kind of funding oil and gas exploration to a large extent, and so I was wondering if there's any kind of connection there in relation to these issues.
It's possible.
It's totally possible. Surprising at all. Yeah, it's only surprising that you have some lobbyists in Washington trying to push as much as possible in silence and quietly to say, guys, don't fund them. Don't back them up, because
but bear in mind the auto industry is also a very powerful lobby too. So but speaking of the auto industry, I think the biggest problem for the Americans, but specifically the Americans, Elon Musk this week laid off 10% of his work. Huge. I think it was 10% of the workforce was laid off around the world, and is suffering some real downturns in part because EV sales are slowing dramatically in the United States, and so that's also going to keep these companies. If demand slumps for EV battery metals, that's going to keep them on the sidelines as well. Because the market just isn't there in the near term. And so it's and that was, again, I think the report should have addressed those market realities. And these are not temporary things.
I think they didn't want to go to the private sector part of the situation. It was focused on the public sector. They say let's focus on the public policy. Let's give the tool to the public and to the decision makers what they can do. For the private, we're gonna let them assume how they can react to how the market changes. I think that's what they wanted to move forward.
Okay. Well, we hope that you guys will take a listen to the show. It's a fantastic show. We just want to thank Terrence McCulley, Ambassador McCulley, who was the former ambassador to 3 African countries, including Nigeria. Very interesting. We're really grateful for his time to join us on the show. I can see that our bandwidth is starting to lag a little bit, guys, and that's what happens when you do Vietnam, South Africa, and Mauritius. So that's also our cue that we're getting time to wrap it up. Just want to thank everybody for joining us for this hour. It was great. Thank you guys for always your insights on these issues. We covered a lot of ground, and we'll be back again next week with another episode of the CGSP Roundtable. Have a great weekend, Cobus and Jerome.
Thank you.
Have a great weekend to you too. Bye, guys.
Bye-bye.